Okay, so we are going to model punctuality and get started. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm really excited for our session today and to share with you all these amazing folks we've got assembled. My name is Maiorana. I'm an assistant professor of design at University of California, Davis. And today we're going to be talking about prototyping in organizational context. So really thinking about prototyping in more kind of complex systems. So I'm so excited today because this is a chance for me to assemble folks that are kind of like my all-star list of like favorite people, and I'm often describing them as like, hey, these are some of the like smartest people you'll ever meet as I'm talking to other folks. So this is just really excited for our discussion today. I'm gonna introduce our panelists, but before I do that, I just want to give you a very quick like 30-second overview of how I'm thinking about prototyping. And then we will jump into hearing from what Carissa and Katie and Veronica have to say about how they're thinking about prototyping in the work that they do. But one of the key things I want to just share, and this is from a paper that I recently published at a conference, but the idea is, I want to kind of dismantle this idea of thinking of prototyping as like, you know, a kind of rough version of a physical thing. And the idea is that the way I'm thinking about prototyping, and the reason that I know that Katie and Veronica and Carissa have used it, is just, it is something that is much more about learning than it is about like making a thing that becomes a better thing and a kind of linear progression. And this is really important as we get into more complex kind of systemic challenges like policies or organizational change. And I think there's two things I'll have you keep in mind. Is the real shift is that in traditional modes of prototyping, the idea is that, like, let's say I'm going to make you know, I have this mouse, and the idea is I would focus my learning to make this artifact better. So I would really want to learn about this mouse in order to make a better mouse. The difference that I'd like us to think about is, how can I create an artifact that's actually going to help me learn more about the context in general? And so the idea is, it's kind of inverting that traditional notion so that suddenly the thing isn't the hero, but learning is the hero. So this is just some of the framing that I come to with prototyping, and I know it's one that's kind of shared loosely by Carissa and Katie and Veronica. So that's just some of the setup for today. And what we're going to do is Carissa, Veronica, and Katie are each going to go through talking about the ways that what they do in their work. Each of them have kind of a fascinating work history and experience. So they're going to share some of that, and then we've got some questions for them, and then I'd love to hear questions from you all as we go through, because I think you'll gain a ton of insight from hearing what they have to say. So with that, I want to introduce Carissa Carter. And Carissa is the academic director at the Stanford University D School. So Carissa, why don't you take it away, introduce yourself, and we can kick it off.
Thanks, Tom. It's great to be here and great to see all of you or your icon faces. As Tom mentioned, so I'm the academic director at the Stanford D School, and we teach design to students across Stanford University in every single discipline. So all 7 schools at Stanford, from medicine to engineering to humanities and sciences, law, education, and School of Earth, they all come to the D School to take design classes and learn how to apply design like back in their home disciplines. So it's a very cross-pollinating type of place. I'm a designer and an educator now, but earlier in my career, I was a geologist. And so I went to graduate school for geology. I worked at both NOAA and the survey, USGS, for a while. And I feel like as a designer, I've really carried threads of of that science through me in the different types of work that I do. And so, you know, being here at a conference like this today is it's really kind of like a meeting of, a melding of my interests, and that excites me. I want to share a framework for how I think about design. And I think it'll build some on what Tom introduced, you know, when he was talking about the mouse as an artifact. And just to ground you in how I think about it. So when I think of like, what is design work? Like he said with the mouse, right? Design work can be products, right? It can be, you know, this iPhone here. Somebody decided what radius of a corner, you know, should be on it, right? Somebody designed the kind of glass. Somebody designed the digital products that are on here too. All of these apps, right? Physical and digital work is design work. But then there's also the experiences that are enabled by those products. So you can have a video call with people on the other side of the world, right? Somebody designed how that's going to happen. And then of course, it's the systems that all of this resides within. So on this phone here, you know, as an employee of Stanford, I'm a cog in that Stanford system. They provide this phone and I have to abide by those rules. I'm also on an AT&T phone plan. Somebody designed how that system works. If I want a new app, I have to get it from the app store, right? Somebody designed how that students work, that system works. There's so many different systems in our lives, and I think that's a big part of what we're talking about today. And then of course, there's the technologies that power all this, right? So when I go to use a text message chat, you know, it'll autocorrect, right? If you spell something wrong, we've all experienced that. My name Carissa is sometimes in Western dictionaries and sometimes not, and so it will often autocorrect to carrot or to carcass if it's the first time you've written it. Right? And somebody designed how that algorithm works. Somebody designed that technology. And importantly, they designed what kind of data powers that technology too, and what to include and what not to include. So it might sound kind of funny if my name autocorrects to carcass, but like, we all know that like that kind of stuff added up doesn't feel great at all, right? And who's excluded and who's included in what we're creating, like goes all the way down to these little details. And importantly, you know, the thing that surrounds it all is that no matter what kind of work you're doing, whether you are a policy designer and you're building new policies out there, or you are somebody, you know, building an actual physical product, that computer mouse, everything we put in the world has implications, first, second, third order implications. Sometimes we can predict them and sometimes we can't. And so I'm excited today to talk with all of you because I do believe that prototyping really helps us prototype what those implications may be and helps us, no matter what type of maker we are, it helps us be intentional about what we're putting out there. So thank you. I will pass it on.
Oh, rookie mistake, I was muted. Thank you, Carissa. Awesome, great to see that. If we can now go on to Veronica, if you want to share.
Yeah, and also from my side, absolute pleasure to be here. My name is Veronica Conchita. I actually also came into what I'm doing today through the energy industry. I was working at energy, like business model changes in private sector companies in the energy industry, and actually very closely tied to how they would change their strategies in response to regulatory change. So back then, like 12 years ago or something like that, it was like we had this big discussion around energy vision and transition. And that's actually what led me to what I'm doing today, or what I did jumpstart just after, which was start working around using design for business model changes. And then most importantly, strategy change. So I call myself a design strategist, and I've been trying to make sense of policies, which are strategies in the public sector, how I at least look at them, and also how business models change and how both in tandem change. And I'm also a PhD candidate in the same field. So I look into how design actually can start and help support creating value from everything we put forward in international policy. So you know about me now that I'm a practitioner and that I also try to look critically at what we do. So what Carissa was just saying, doing things with intent, that's really at the heart of everything that I care about. And 1.5 years ago, approximately, the company that I now work for and have been working for since, and at Facebook/Meta Inc., they approached me and they asked me, like, can you help us? Can you actually implement policy prototyping in practice? Like, how are we going to do that? And I said, hell yeah, I want to do that. I had been thinking about that already before, also when I was still at Stanford for a while. And I all of a sudden got the platform to do that. And what we ended up pulling out and what I ended up building up and manage since is a project that is called Open Loop. And the way we think about Open Loop, and also when you look it up, openloop.org, you will find a narrative, and that narrative says, Open Loop is a global experimental governance program that helps bridge the gap between technology and regulatory innovation. So here we are again, like trying to bring together different worlds and interfaces in a way. And Open Loop is also similar to what Carissa was saying, like the design skill is a way of cross-pollination between different ways of thinking and doing. And the same is like, it's just the same for Open Loop. It's not just an experimental governance program, but it's also a collaborative governance program. So when we implement programs globally and try to learn about how to make policies that address emerging technologies and at the same time how to make products that address responsible AI concerns, what we do is we think of it together as a consortium of private sector delegates or business entities of all sizes, academia, civil society, and obviously governmental delegates and regulators. So in the next couple of minutes, just a few words on what Open Loop actually is and how we think of experimental governance through prototyping therein. So imagine that policy prototyping to us means we create normative frameworks, policy frameworks, policy proposals, legal provisions, articles in the form of a prototype. And we test those norms in that prototype version together with actually those who are supposed to make use of such policies in the real world. So mostly when you think about AI transparency policies or AI policies in general, it would be companies, right? For instance, this is what I always call the policy users. And at the same time, when we policy prototype, we actually really want to give the policy recipients, the policy users, a chance to enhance their products through policy. So we look at policy in a way as a guide, as a creative constraint or force that can actually help companies hopefully also build better products, right? And so everything we do in policy prototyping really is taken from the design, from the original product design ways of thinking. And it's just that you don't, if you were the company participating in our program, it's just that you're not using a service or a product, but you're actually using a policy and you're telling us how you experience the policy. And very often policy is not really thought of as an experience. It's similar to what Tom mentioned. We are talking of it as a thing, and we like a policy, you know, we might care of what it actually says in its final version, but we are not really interested in the trajectory. So what we want to uncover really is the trajectory of how policy can be in a way integrated at product level, and how product can also hopefully feed back useful insights to how policy should look like. And a final sentence, when you look at our homepage, you will find a few sets of programs that we work on, and we work globally. So in the Asia Pacific region, in Latin America, and Europe. And there are going to be more programs to come, hopefully. And what I want to close this, like my initial statement with, is simply that from our first program that we ran by simulating an automated decision making impact assessment with 10 companies across Europe, what we found is that all the companies were actually able to assess risks, risks that stem from their technologies that they are using and building into products. but they were making sense of risks in a very functional, in a very technology-driven way. So they were looking at risks in the data, like in the data set. They were focusing on data set buy-ins or performance issues of their models. What they did not focus on are the structural risks, or what we know as socio-technological risks. So what about human well-being? What about fairness concerns? What about human interaction or user autonomy? Those things were not obvious to companies, but when we gave them a guide, they were really thinking this was helpful and this was great and it enhanced their product. So I think it's really fundamentally about, prototyping is really about fundamentally giving a chance to experience what a better way of doing a proper thing, like the thing that you were used to doing, like of getting, like how do you get there, and letting that be experienced. So that's how I look at policy prototyping, and I'm really looking forward to the panel.
Awesome. Thanks, Verena. And yeah, I'm also very excited as there's so many different interconnections between all of you, and I'm sure, and so many of you in the audience. But finally, Katie, I'd love to have you talk about your work.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tom. And thanks to everyone for being here. My name is Katie Krummeck. I'm based in Portland, Oregon. I came to this work of human-centered design and trying to change the status quo and push innovative solutions as an educator in the K-12 system, and started my career as a teacher, helped found a school, worked in a education nonprofit kind of startup, and was always the thread that kind of continued through my early career was asking questions about how to create more student-centered learning experiences and how to create school that was more human for not just the adults, but the kids in the system. And then kind of by chance came across the folks at the D School and design thinking and human-centered design, and was able to make a leap into that and started working then on building capacity in individuals who were embedded in these systems and making decisions that create those experiences. And since then have worked more and more in terms of, as a designer, embedding with teams to help guide that practice and that decision-making. I recently came on with the Aga Khan Foundation as their Global Innovation and Design Advisor. They work in 20 plus countries around the world, trying to improve outcomes for people in impoverished communities. And I'm tasked with helping to integrate human-centered design as a decision-making, an approach to decision-making and resource allocation by, again, building capacity with my colleagues, and also embedding with teams to help develop some of those decisions. And this is really pretty recent. I came on board there. Up until then, recently I worked on projects, again, around trying to change the status quo or address inequity in these complex systems, whether it was school systems or other social systems. Some of the examples of projects I worked on in the last year were reimagining the discipline process for Dallas Independent School District. So it's an example where the superintendent had decided that he wanted to eliminate expulsions and suspensions in that system. And I was hired to lead a team to help figure out how to actually implement that in a way that felt appropriate for the community and that allowed for a smooth transition. I worked on a project around addressing systemic racism in a childcare licensing system in Oregon. I worked with Tom on a project a year ago around how to help design safe experiences around voting and administering the election in 2020. So lots of experiences in thinking about these systems. And I think coming from the K-12 education system, I've learned a ton about how a particular system can be resistant and resilient to change of any kind, and how human-centered design can help unlock and move things forward in a different direction, even if it's very slowly or in pockets of a larger system. But it is also difficult work and work that I love. So I'm excited to be bringing those experiences now to a broader portfolio of social impact projects, and excited for the conversation about prototyping.
Super. Thanks, Katie. So one of the things that I think is really fascinating about for us to be here at this conference is just the type of work. I know all of us mentioned design in some way, shape, or form, but the tools that we're talking about aren't specialized to design. And I'm sure that all of you probably are doing some kind of form of this in your work. So I just hope it doesn't seem like this is a kind of a designer type of tool. I think we come to it from design, and design gives language to an approach that I think is something that, it has, the name prototype comes from a product design kind of lineage, but that doesn't mean it's only applied there, and I think only applied by designers. So to that end, there's a couple of things. One, I would love to hear just questions, if there's questions that are emerging from the audience for the panelists. I would love to see those in the chat. But as you all are formulating those, I think the question I have, and I'll let Katie, Carissa, and Veronica jump in, no particular order, but I'm curious if there's a kind of prototyping example that you've used that maybe in your work around, because I know all of you are doing tremendously difficult things, whether it's in education or policy or working with kind of like Carissa, the range of systems you're working on. I'm curious how, like, if any of you would want to share an example of something you prototyped and how you thought about that. Carissa, you're unmuted. Yeah.
I'm happy to. I mean, I think about this probably like on a couple of different levels here. So in my day-to-day week right now, I'm primarily an educator. So I'm constantly prototyping like how a lesson's going to be delivered, or the right organization for students in a degree program and things like that. But I'll say that I also have, I was thinking about this earlier, and there's a student project that I feel like is a really, interesting form of prototyping, because, as I was talking about, like, there are things at a technological level, and then there are things at a policy level that get prototyped. And I just pulled it here, and I'd love to just share screen real fast, because I think it's easier than me trying to talk to it. So there's two students, Adrian Baer and Nicole Gonzalez, and they did this project. So I'm sharing their work right here. So Tom asked how I prototype. I'm going to tell you how some of our students have prototyped. They were mapping flood water. Okay, so like after a hurricane, right, or areas are prone to flooding, and when the floods recede or don't, that affects different families in different places differently. And these two students, they focused a lot on Houston post Hurricane Harvey. They did a lot of interviews to understand the experience of living post Hurricane Harvey. They were trying to figure out like where in this overall system they could make change, and so they're trying on trying to figure out how to understand what how people that are affected by a hurricane can receive both aid and insurance payouts post disaster. A lot of times, in a project like this, you don't quite know where, you want to have impact in a certain area, but you don't quite know like which part of this system is the one that I can have the most impact on, or like, where should I focus? In this graph, they're essentially showing that there are ways to understand how different people have been affected by floodwaters, whether that's manually looking at water lines on fence posts, or using drones or some other kind of remote sensing system to look at like where water has advanced to or pulled away from. Getting even like crowdsourced Twitter info about people communicating what has happened. But they saw this gap in automated real-time reporting, and they decided to focus in that space as a way to create something automated that would help these communities recover equitably and efficiently. And I'll just quickly move here. What this involves for them was this these water level sensors that would be attached to power poles or light posts, all things owned by the city, and connected together in some type of off-grid network. So like right now you're thinking of like there's product here, but then there's also the system of how it's connected, and then the policy that governs that, right? Like all of those things need to be prototyped and are in play. They have data that needs to be reported, and then part of their idea is like, well, then how then do we allocate aid to people that have proven, or like how do you even know who needs the aid, right? And let me just show when I get to this one slide here for you. So here's just like an example of some of the things that they prototyped within this whole system. Some of it is around the actual data collection using the physical devices themselves. Some things are like they would send kits to people for them to put in their homes and to use and to figure out like what is viable and what isn't. Other things are much higher level workshops. You can see some of those schematics there. They're prototyping. Here's a system of what would happen if this project was put into place, and they're getting people's reactions along the way. So like the prototyping's close cousin, right, is testing with real people, with people in all parts of the system that are affected by whatever design is going to be put in place. And like that's how you see what would work and wouldn't. So the devices that they had, they initially thought, hey, people could put them in their own backyard if they want. We get like a mesh data network that's really fine grained. And while that sounds ideal, what they quickly realized is, one, like oftentimes that price point is too high, and the privacy issues that come up with having any kind of local data collection were beyond what people were willing to tolerate. So then it meant like partnering with a city or some level of municipality to figure out like, oh, okay, like where could we put these sensors so that you get enough fine-grained resolution that it actually means something, but not too much that people feel like they're being followed, right? And so like that is just a few places where I really think they did a nice job in prototyping specifically as related to an actual real challenge out there.
That's great. Katie, Verena, anything to add? And and Lisa, I think that there's a question for Carissa around the difference between prototyping and testing. I'm curious, Chris, or any of you, if you have thoughts there. I personally feel like I feel like there's no point in prototyping if you're not testing, but I'm curious if any of you all have a different point of view.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Yeah, for sure. I think what I was gonna say and add is, I think of I know there's a lot of process maps and ways of expressing design thinking or human-centered design. And I feel like if you step back in really broad strokes, there are kind of two buckets. One is deeply understanding the needs and emotions of the people that you're collaborating with or working to serve, and experimentation. And I think that experimentation is this bucket of prototyping and testing. And going out and trying to kind of dislodge our assumptions. I think actually both buckets are about trying to question and dislodge our assumptions about a particular system. And I think it's particularly important for people who have deep expertise in a context. They can take for granted how much they take for granted and assume. And so by using experimentation and prototyping and testing to push beyond your kind of belief about the system, it can help you to also see opportunities beyond the status quo. And so for me, that's what prototyping is all about, is how do we take both bring the insights that we've gained from the community and the system, bring those to life quickly, rapidly, but also how do we question the assumptions that we're making about either that particular solution that we're thinking about, or about our beliefs about the system in general. And so the more that we can push ourselves to use those tools to kind of break open our understanding of a particular dynamic, I think the more successful implementation of those solutions is.
I'll second that, Katie. I feel like you said it so well, right? Prototypes are like help you see your assumptions and then, help you challenge them too, right? And they kind of bring to light things that you maybe thought were true about something. And then the minute that testing happens, right, that you try it with somebody or some group of people, like you realize either I was off or, I didn't have the full picture in my head.
One thing I want to add to is just that I think the barrier to prototyping is so much lower than you probably think it is. And I'll give an example. There was a couple of years ago, I was helping to launch an initiative at the Claremont colleges in Southern California. And it was all these different, it was a problem that I think is, organizational at its core. And so there are all these different stakeholders with different needs. But one of the things that I was thinking of as a prototype that I think you all probably do, or you're probably doing this, but you might not be thinking of it as a prototype. But basically, there was a weekly meeting, and we invited, a number of stakeholders. So, and then what we were doing is, but it was a prototype because we're also paying attention to what are we learning through this meeting invite. So one of the things was who's showing up, right? Who's showing up week after week? Another thing that happened was that the food was awful. We just had it was unfortunate, but we had a bad caterer. And so that became another thing where it's like, they're not showing up for the food, because then when we had nice dinners, then other people came, but we were like, oh, they're actually not committed to the project. So it was a matter of taking the full context and being like, okay, what are all these things going on and what can we learn from them? And I think that's, any of you looking to do any kind of organizational change, one of the things that I've seen, I think all of everyone who's here today do is just, what if you can, oops, sorry. There's some kind of alert in California came through my phone, sorry about that. But one of the things that I've seen everyone do is create like a 5-minute intervention in a normal meeting, right? What if you just pause and have people introduce each other, or something like that can be something that almost anyone can do. And that can be a prototype to see, how does it go over? Is it worth maintaining? Is it getting the results you're looking for? So anyway, just in terms of, I would just demystify this idea of prototyping and really think about how do you try something with minimal risk?
What I'd add before you maybe want to launch another question is, I fully agree with what's been said. And I'd also add that prototyping is really a wonderful way to get surprised by what else can be done and how else we can think. And it's like, in my space, at least, working between governments and the EU Commission, or like bigger bodies and businesses or civil society, very often it's just that it's a very simple reason why things aren't, like often very simple why things aren't done. It's because we all have very full schedules. And very often it's very, very simple reasons why things are just not thought of in a more creative way. And there's a very particular just example that stands out to me from my own work in open loop, which is, and I uncovered it by doing the first policy prototyping program under open loop. And it was still called policy prototyping. It was the first pilot. We launched it together with the Singaporean data protection regulator. And what happened is that I only then started to realize that companies like startups with which we tested, like they need to implement the policy. Like I've been in policy for a long time, but I never saw that there are companies who need to implement the policy that actually stems from a very different body. So there is a logical disconnect. The policy relies on companies to implement. And that there was a fundamentally different understanding of what AI and the technology actually was. In the policy narrative, you have AI as this big system, like game changer, and it's potentially a risk for society. And it's like a huge narrative. Like when you look at certain international organization bodies' narratives, it seems like totally, like as if it was totally changing the way we worked, and which it does probably. But in the eyes of all the startups that I've been working with, like AI was either a way to make things more efficient or make processes more, optimize processes in a way and durations, or it was a thing to maybe reduce carbon emissions and hence create in a way impact. But there was never this like big disruptive connotation. So I think it's also really about aligning different ideas about the same thing and just trying to unpack and get a different viewpoint on a thing that you were working on. And I think it's also about trying to get out of our comfort zones and starting to think differently about different like stereotypes that are there between different sectors, like product builders don't care or policy is always slow. Those are those are narratives that we should prototype around to and let things change for a better and more purposeful society.
I love that point, Verena, about surprise, because I think one of the traditional ways of thinking about prototyping is that like, oh, I want validation, and I want to like put my thing in the world, and I want to hear good things about it, and that's totally natural. But I think the way I think about it is that like, if you're not surprised, you're not learning, and that learning is gonna save you so much time, effort, money over the long run. There's an awesome question from Leith around like, what are some approaches you use to get buy-in? I'm curious if any of you have. We've just got a couple of minutes before, and then we'll have chat rooms where you all will be able to kind of meet with us individually if you'd like. I'm curious if anyone has tips about how to get buy-in for this kind of work.
Well, I just dropped this as a response in there, and I think one thing that I found useful, if you're dealing with your reluctant people in the ecosystem, is to simply acknowledge like, this is a prototype for this week or these 2 weeks, and then we are going to talk about, we're going to compare this way and this way, right? Even just like those simple guardrails help people be a part of what you're doing instead of like something being done to them. And so the more that you can make it a co-design work, the better the experience everybody's going to have.
I think one thing I would say too is that the reality is, this is echoing what other folks have said too. The reality is that essentially everything we do is a prototype, right? Like whether we're launching something, a technology at scale, or we're trying something for 5 minutes in meeting, the difference is the risk, right? And the risk for having poor outcomes or unintended consequences. And so talking to folks about like, we can either work at our desks for 2 years on this policy and then implement it as a prototype and see at scale if it fails or succeeds, or we can try to limit the risk by creating these low resolution, quick experiments to understand our assumptions, so that when we get to the point of trying to implement at scale, we have confidence that the thing that we're trying to do is going to hopefully should have the outcomes that we're seeking. So trying to kind of continuously remind people that everything we're doing all the time is an experiment. It's a risk, and we can actually lower the risk and improve the success rate if we create those rapid cycles and do it in a small way before we put everything into, you know, one basket. I talk about how do we invest in or slow the process down so that we can scale success, right? And I think oftentimes people want to just skip the process and scale success, but we know that that has those risks associated with it.
That's great, Katie. Verena, anything to add?
Yeah, definitely. Like when you look at, for instance, the policy discourse, what companies want is clarity. Companies want to have a clear policy so they can align with the policy. They want to know what a policy says, but in a way that can work because policy is said to lag, to lag behind product development. I'm not convinced about that rhetoric, by the way. But I think what we are should not just be looking for, like we should not just be looking for at reducing risk. We should just try to look for aligning on a certain purpose and a certain vision and a certain direction where we're going to go into. We should align on a purposeful role in a systems, at least of each and every one of us. Like, what's the role of a tech company in 20 years from now, in 30 years from now? What's the role of policy today, in 10 years, in 15 years? What's the role of an individual? What's the role of technology? And I feel that sometimes aligning on the intent and the goal and the vision, if that already could be prototyped, we would probably speak a bit less about just risks and what needs to be hindered, but more about what can be enabled. And we would open our discussions and our mindsets a bit more. So it gets very philosophical here, guys. So gotta stop.
No, but I mean, and I think there's no need to apologize if that's what it is. I think the thing to also just kind of something that came up as you all were talking, I think the other piece around buy-in is, you know, as Carissa was saying too, like, you know, that you're kind of incorporating folks, so saying, hey, we're just going to do this for a contained amount of time as a setup. The other thing is, I think afterwards saying like, hey, we only spent X amount of time. And I think like, and look what we learned, you know, could we have, you know, like was that hour really, you know, like look what we learned in 1 hour. And I think just really reflecting about how efficient the process is. And I think that can also just help people to understand, like, I'm not asking you to, you know, kind of bet your future career or, you know, like huge amounts of budget. This is like just really clarifying the ratio of learning to time, and that piece, and that where I think if you can help that come through, then it's much easier for folks to kind of weigh those in a clear way. They're like, oh yeah, it is only one meeting, or it's a, you know, it's a half hour of a meeting or whatever it might be. And that's where I think you can get folks on board, because you're not asking them to overinvest. Yeah.
Yeah, I think to add here, and I believe there was a comment in the chat previously speaking about the fact you have to be clear about the intent and what you want to test for, etc. I fully align with that, because as also Tom and all, like the other two speakers have said, Kate and Carissa, like also from my experience, you can prototype policy in 20 minutes, 5 minutes, 4 weeks, as we've done, 6 months, or 4 months. And it purely depends on what your intent is, what you want to get out of it, and what you want to learn, and probably the experience that you want to create for each and everyone who's involved. So yeah, lots of different ways of doing prototyping in systems.
Yeah, I think that's we've got 20 seconds left. So I think, Veronica, that's a great wrap. Can we go around maybe just any literally final word?
Okay, it's over. Did we miss it?
Quick, squeeze it in.
Oh, I was just gonna say, prototyping is so important, right? Because everything breaks even when it's working exactly as you planned it.
Yeah. Oh, well said.